and welcome to another episode of The Lion's Den. My name's Toby Bennett from Black Crow Gaming, and we are still talking about Dark Angels. Don't you worry, I know some of you were slightly worried about the fact that I was coming off Dark Angels for a little bit. Don't worry about that at all. It's partly so I can broaden my own horizons. It's partly because I've got to think about the potential for WTC next year if I was to try out for one of the international teams. You do need that flexibility to compete, and if I need to make a sort of specialism for myself, that might well be power armor, which is why I'm switching across, just to kind of have a look what Blood Angels looks and feels like. And also it's the perfect time because Dark Angels are in that bit of a slump at the moment. However, with slump comes innovation. So I think it's a really good time for us as a hive mind to sit down and really go over what we think options could be for adapting and changing to the meta. But I think we've got to frame the problem. Problem's a strong word. It's a problem for us. It's not a problem, I think, as much for GW or the meta in general, because apart from the outliers of Death Guard, Chaos Knights and Imperial Knights, the meta is reasonably balanced so far at the moment. There is a data slate coming. Everyone is assuming there is a data slate coming in early September. I think I'd be shocked if it didn't. I'm really hoping it's all done before LGT and I get a bit of time to test because hopefully I'll be back on Dark Angels. But equally, I think we should assume that there's not going to be a massive rewrite for Dark Angels. I personally believe they should. I think that the Codex supplement hasn't really stood the test of time, to put it gently. I think... unfortunately, given the context of so many other books and so many supplements that have come out since, it just feels incredibly lackluster because apart from Azrael, the units that we use were actually not in the book in the first place, and we don't use any detachments that are in that book really, apart from the upgraded Company of Hunters. Everything had to have some kind of errata. Or just rewrite in general. So I think that was a real big swing and a miss. But for the sake of this video, we are going to assume that there is not going to be a big rewrite. But if the data slate was to coincide with Marines 2.0, then we should expect something more considerable. Obviously, we've just seen the new kind of Salamanders detachment drop, so it's worth bearing in mind that things like that could happen. It could be quite dramatic in terms of change. We could lose Oath of Moment and gain a new ability. We could get complete rewrites to our detachments. Things like... Wrath the Rock are linked to things like Oath of Moment, where we can re-oath a target and things like that. So surely there would have to be some decent amount of rewriting, because there would be some fundamentals that would change. And I would also feel that the rules team and balance team now would probably be in a better spot to do that. However, for the sake of this video, we're going to assume that's not happening and that there's not going to be mass change. It's just going to be, a couple of points changes, things like that. But we are going to be using the current points values just in case we don't get any changes, because there is an argument that some of our sort of key predators, if they get a little nerf, then we're in a better spot anyway. So without further ado, what is the changing meta? I've kind of covered about the new books a little bit, but I think we've got to add context that the new book coming out, Votan, has a lot of 3 damage weapons. And we are seeing a lot more, interestingly, 3 damage weapons with anti-vehicle, anti-monster 3 up. So Wolfen, the Berserkers, I believe the Thunderkin also have that weapon as well. So there is a lot more 3 damage sort of flying around for what we'll be likely to use in the meta. Obviously, we've already seen the drones out of Death Guard being an auto-include of 3 of them because they just are so good for their points cost. And I think that sort of that creep up of damage, that really stings Dark Angels, because our main reliance on the Inner Circle ability of being -1 damage, it was so good previously because it reduced your opponent's damage output by 50% per shot. But now it's only reducing it, say, by 33% per shot, which I think is such a change of impact that simply something at 250 points, losing that level of, essentially losing 22% efficiency, That's huge, and I think that's hugely problematic. So that higher damage output overall is becoming a lot more normal. We're seeing out of Death Guard that their damage output's very high. Votan have sort of got rid of some of that survivability for more damage, again with the Berserkers going down to 1 wound, for example. Space Wolves, Black Templars, again, extremely killy, but they do die to a stiff breeze. Thousand Suns, again, super, super killy, and with the exception of Magnus, they are reasonably soft and squishy, but that's only if you can get into them. So we are seeing a lot more in terms of that, like, because everyone is bringing a tactical nuke to the table, things die very, very easily. So sort of building that strategy around sort of protecting yourself is very difficult. And that sort of segues us nicely. It's almost like I planned this into what that means for us. I don't think that an army focused around survivability can really dominate and push to that next level, especially with high damage output stat check armies out there. So Knights obviously being the sort of the main offender currently in terms of their damage output, but Knights, Thousand Suns, Death Guard, Votan when they come out, these are all armies that just do not struggle to kill Deathwing Knights, and that's hugely problematic. So the fact that that meta has changed and shifted both in terms of that general approach to damage output, but also that approach to not really looking back at the previous codexes and helping them out, I think Deathwing Knights have really struggled. So they are paying the price for a meta that is nearly a year old now, if not a year old now. So I think something would need to change for them to be relevant, but also I think there might have to be quite a lot that would have to change because of that as I say, that 22% drop in efficiency. But then also we've had challenger cards. Obviously they have been sort of met with quite a negative reaction, and I think justifiably. I think overall challenger cards are quite poor. And I don't think there's many people that would disagree with that in sort of competitive circles, even if they're benefiting from them. And I certainly did at the ITT, turning a couple of what should have been very heavy losses into slightly closer games. But early board dominance that we used with like Stormlance and things like that, that is really being punished. Because the difference between us and, say, a Blood Angels lag in Stormlance was that we might throw ourselves at the opponent and we might kill such a high portion of their army that they can't then do anything. But what we would definitely do is tie up enough of their army in positions around the board so that they weren't scoring points. And ultimately, we build that unassailable lead and get through. However, challenger cards completely screw that up. And it's why I jumped so quickly away from Stormlance when challenger cards were released with this new mission pack. However, and it's a big, big however, there are ways to adapt that, and I would expect there will be tweaks and changes to challenger cards when we have a slate. I think probably that points deficit will grow, but there's also an argument that we can change the way that we look at Stormlance and look for a more denial-focused game rather than that high upboard pressure while we score points, because at that point we were using lower OC units, like Deathwing Knights obviously only being 1 OC. But we could also now start looking at the sort of the higher OC units out of Stormlance. So, what do we do to adapt to this new meta? I think we have to look for those new options, and I think we have to look for that both in the normal Space Marine Codex and our own detachments. Like the first one is obviously Company of Hunters has been doing pretty well in the States. Overall, I am not a fan of Company of Hunters. The detachment rule is incredible, but I don't think the stratagems line up well enough. When I was looking at kind of how could I build that damage output, etc., there was never really quite enough. I think it really lacks like giving lance to a mounted unit, and in terms of protecting itself, it kind of struggles as well. So it's like it's got merit to it for sure, But I think Challenger cards also sting Company of Hunters in terms of like how it could interact and be successful. So I think, you know, there might be an element that Company of Hunters actually is, it's a local thing. It's not really been something that has dominated at larger tournaments. It's definitely not something that's translated across to the UK or Europe, to my knowledge. So I don't think Company of Hunters really holds that answer to us. We're really seeing it at smaller tournaments having its success. But there is a question, you know, do we start leveraging speed over survivability? I know that's what I'm looking at in Blood Angels because everything moves 12 inches. So is it time for our Ravenwing units to really shine? And by Ravenwing, of course, I mean Outriders, because our Ravenwing units, apart from the Command Squad and Samael, absolutely suck. So let's hope that they get a little bit of love in the slate as well. But yeah, I think that's going to be an interesting one for sure. Company of Hunters, I think, is potentially a solid answer and something that I would like to look into more. I really like the enhancement that allows you to come in a turn earlier because we can use that if our opponent goes first, we can rapid ingress, or we can just come in on the board turn 1 and set up for sort of a really big turn 2 and crush through things. The only thing that I worry about is that sort of that high toughness stat check. And I think that could cause real issues for that Company of Hunters list because the +1 to wound that it does have is infantry, and I think it might be like infantry and mounted, but it doesn't hit vehicles, which I think is the most problematic thing. Okay, so let's draw some comparisons. And let's try and work out what we can do. So we know that the best gunline Marines is Ultramarines Gladius. Now, what makes that tick? It's Guilliman for the most part. You know, that double oath, and that because of the fact it's super oath as well, extremely strong. However, what are the elements that allow it to keep up with that damage output? Vindicators are certainly up there. It looks at that kind of 2-up save plus damage output. So your Ballistas, your Vindicators, obviously Guilliman himself, and kind of then playing pieces that enhance that damage output with that little bit of survivability just at the back of your mind to ensure that you're able to kind of compete at that positive rate. In terms of speed, I think the best army probably is Blood Angels, Liberator Assault Group. Things like Death Company just spitting out damage output at really low costs. Just absolute hordes of Marines. You should see the way that I've had to pack my box. It's got I think 25 minis underneath one of the trays hanging on like they are bats, which I guess maybe is quite fitting for Blood Angels. But what makes it tick again? Partly the detachment rule, but equally it's a lot of speed, it's a lot of aggression, it's the ability to up that aggression with things like Red Rage or Red Rampage or whatever it's called. I know what it does, not what it's called. And then it's able to kind of leverage that trading game a little bit more efficiently, a little bit differently to, say, Stormlance Dark Angels, which was like, I'm going to hold you in this position. No, instead it goes, I'm not going to hold you in this position. I'm going to kill whatever is here. Then I'm going to die, and then another unit's going to come out. So that's an interesting one in terms of that survivability speed comment that I was making earlier. In terms of all-rounder, my gut says it's probably some flavour of Space Wolves. I've said Gladius because that is a very safe guess. Space Wolves Gladius is class, Wolfen, really good. The Head Takers, real good. There's a lot of really strong elements to it. Obviously, they have taken that nerf. If you were watching the WTC, that rules cutoff was pre the Iron Priests making Predators as horrendously good as they are. So that doesn't exist anymore. So that is quite major if you're looking at the WTC lists for sort of examples on what good might look like. So do just bear that one in mind. In terms of the shooting speed, well, in terms of what makes Space Wolves Gladius good, it's hard to say. I mean, it's high damage output in combat. Again, it feels a little bit like lag, but a little bit more survivable because it's got a few more 4-up invulnerable saves in the shield using guys, but they are very cheap still. 100 points for those 3 damage output. Wolfram, extremely good with that 4-up invulnerable save. Head takers, 4-up invulnerable save. But again, it feels like they are scrapping on objectives rather than forcing our opponent to sort of hold back in their deployment zone, and potentially sort of denying, and then having that overwhelming turn which turns a corner. So we're starting to sort of see a string of what is making Marine successful. It's that battle and sort of counter points that your opponent is trying to score while sort of focusing on your secondaries, keeping the score reasonably close, and then having that moment where you dial it up to 11 and have that really powerful go turn so that you break their back and push on forward, which I think Stormlance could do, but I don't think it's efficient enough in the way that it does it now, because it didn't have the damage output of these kinds of armies. So its way of doing that was often just to lock people in position, but it didn't have the numbers to do that. And now in terms of that, both survivability and being punished by challenger cards, that's why it is to a lesser extent as good in that place. Finally, just in terms of shooting speed, I really like the Ultramarine Stormlance list. The Storm Raven, very, very good. All of the very cheaply costed speeders, really nice. I think there's a lot of arguments to sort of look at them. And I think, when I sort of talk through a list that I've brewed up, they are definitely in conversation because they synergize very well with Stormlance's ability for -1 to hit, -1 to wound. But again, it's something that is made tick by Guilliman. And that feels really quite major, that we just have no way to sort of get those other rerolls elsewhere, which is a bit of a shame, but I think that is probably the largest outlier in this list of like how we can draw comparisons. But I think by taking all of that, we are building this image that it score modestly in the early game, focus more on that denial to keep your opponent's score low, and then towards the end of the game you have that bigger push where your opponent's only going to be able to draw like 1 or 2 challenger cards, and ideally they won't have the resources to sort of clap you back at that point. Which I think is a very new way to play for Dark Angels, because I think Wrath of the Rock doesn't really play like that. Wrath of the Rock is we sit on primary and we force our opponent to come to us. If suddenly they can leverage that just to get higher damage output from things like challenger cards, that's going to cause some serious issues. But I think now we kind of have that semi-template of how we need to do it. So let's talk list. This is something that I just I threw together. It's a Stormlance Dark Angels list. Now you might be going, right, well, why? You've already talked about Company of Hunters. Why have you not opted for that? Reason that I've not opted for Company of Hunters is purely around the stratagems. I just think having access to -1 to hit, -1 to wound, and a flat 6 reactive move are extremely powerful in terms of defensive abilities. Obviously, the Lion can't use that anymore, which is a bit of a shame, but all the others can. Very, very nice. And then also having access to Lance, and because it gives reroll charges, which is real nice, there is that element where you can just have that upped damage output for a turn and really punish your opponent. So let's talk through the list. Azrael and 5 Assault Intercessors. I think that is very self-explanatory. It gives us that CP advantage. It gives us that strength to be able to sort of keep on competing in the CP game with other things like Tallymen, Guilliman, all of that kind of good stuff. Azrael is exceptional. 5 Assault Intercessors allow him to really skirmish objectives and secure your expansion objective, which I think he's very good at. Combi Lieutenant, again, essential point scoring piece. Done. Lionel Johnson. So the Lion didn't really leverage enough in Wrath of the Rock, I felt, but having consistent advanced charge, fallback charge feels really powerful for the Lion. It sort of elongates his speed, but also it allows us to sort of play that game where we secure our expansion with something that your opponent is not going to be able to deal with, i.e. the Lion, and either force them to come and like trade a unit to deny you, and the Lion will just sort of slaughter whatever it is, or they have to commit to try and remove the Lion, and he's got fights first. There's lots of different ways that you can then force your opponent into the open with the Lion which will then allow you to sort of go for that hammer blow to ultimately break your opponent's back. Now, timing that is not going to be easy, and I think it's going to take a lot of time to really understand how we can best leverage the line in a list like this, but I do think that there is play there. And also, just uppy-downy on that guy, like, really quite good. And also, there is that element where on that big go turn, you go, okay, we're going to flip to reroll ones to hit and wound in combat, let's go. And sometimes the line will just absolutely pop off. So then we've got Ravenwing Command Squad with 6 Outriders, and they've got Fainting Withdrawal because I had 10 points left over. That just means they can fall back and shoot as well. It's largely irrelevant, but it's kind of cool. With those Plasma Talons, I think that might be quite useful. So these guys are really your annoying skirmishers. They're going to sort of stop your opponent from scoring in the early game, really get in their face, play that interference game, really take advantage of that -1 to hit, -1 to win, but they also have the potential to do that high damage output. So if your opponent is that kind of stat check, they can just go for it and do significant damage to your opponent. The 3 damage champion suddenly wounding on 4s with Lance can be really powerful into big knights. So I think there's a lot more play there that just kind of elevates you and potentially gives you that way to sort of really compete again. Obviously, 9 bikes is difficult to hide, but I think that might be where we're at. Then for similar reasons, we've got Samael, because if you can get to a point where you can pincer with Samael, Ravenwing Command Squad, and a Lion, I think that's probably just game over. So it's all about sort of being able to be in the right place at the right time and deliver that hammer blow and just sort of restrict your opponent's resources as much as possible while still holding in those key areas of the game, but not committing too early and sort of going for that exchange game or for going for that sort of holding your opponent in position game. Next, we've got 2x5 JPIs, which we've not seen for a bit. I've opted for them because they have slightly better damage output because of the Mortals and the Power Fist than Vanguard Vets. But if you wanted to have another 4-up invulnerable save unit, then there's definitely an argument that you look at those Vanguard Vets. They survive a lot longer than they deserve to a lot of the time. But I think maybe they are more of a trading piece in this, and I do like just having those additional mortal wounds from, like, you go grenades, you go charging, then you've got a power fist that might pop off. It's all that kind of stuff that just sort of elevates. So I think there's definitely an argument for dropping the enhancement, putting in Vanguard Vets with shields, but equally, personally, I quite like the JPIs. Next, we've got a Ballistus. It just kind of keeps your opponent honest during deployment. That's the main thing for it, because for the most part, we don't have that much heavy shooting. But this Ballistus really keeps your opponent honest. And I think that's great. I think that's really positive to be able to keep your opponent as honest as possible. Then we've got some infiltrators to hold our backfield objective. 6-inch deep strike, I think we're going to see even more. I think subterranean nids are going to start becoming even more of a thing. So having those infiltrators there, good. Bit sad to lose intercessors because sticky objectives are incredible. So there might be some scope where I change things around, but at this point, we're going with the infiltrators for holding home. Then we've got some scouts. Scouts are good. They score points, and points are important. And then we follow up just going into that hammer blow turn again with Vindicators. Now, oftentimes they're going to be coming in from reserve and just blasting any problem to death. At the ITT, I had incredible success in that role. Now, obviously, there was one moment where the Vindicator just completely failed, but that was entirely down to those dice just going really poo. 5 unsaved wounds, only doing 5 damage when it should have been 17 is, a bit bonkers. But apart from that, it did everything that it could in all of those games. So it was really positive in terms of every single game there. So I think Vindicators having that ability to just go, cool, we're going to go for that big turn here. We've got the 2 Vindicators ready. They can potentially pop off and my opponent has to respect them. It also kind of pushes your opponent towards the middle, which I think really helps because the middle tends to be a little bit more open, which is a little bit easier for your bikes to get around and cause those problems. So that's the list. I've kind of gone through the strategy with it. It's something that I'm kind of excited to give a go. It's got no Deathwing Knights, which feels very, very strange. But equally, I think this could be a brave new world, and it will be interesting to see. I think it's definitely a change in style, and I think that change in style is going to take a bit of time. And I think we're going from Stormlance in a very specific style suddenly to Wrath of the Rock, which was very, very different, now back to Stormlance, but in a very different way. So I think there's going to be a lot of toying around and sort of seeing where we end up. One thing that you could do is you could have the Ballista switch for the Speeder, the Thunderstrike, and drop the enhancement, and suddenly those Vindicators can wound Knights on 2s, which is really nice, and take advantage of that -1 to hit, -1 to wound strat. But I think I'd prefer that on the Outriders at this point, just in terms of making sure that they can be as punishing as possible. So finally, I hope that's been useful. Sorry, I have screwed my shoulder up. And I hope that's given you some ideas. But let me know what you think. Let me know what you think in terms of how we can look positively at Dark Angels going forward, because I think it's really important that we try and stay positive at this point. But yeah, what do you reckon? What lists are you thinking of trying? What sort of still excites you about playing Dark Angels? I think for me, it's the Lion. So I think if I'm playing Dark Angels, I want to try and get the Lion in there and really see how I can leverage him to his best effect. And at the moment, I think that's this. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you to all our sponsors, Glasshammer, Terrainforge, Trident Futureworks. Thanks to Dr. J for letting me use his artwork for the thumbnail. Absolute legend. And most importantly, stay loyal, fuckers. And I hope you have a phenomenal afternoon or evening wherever you may be. And I will catch you next week. Cheers. Bye.